First of all, I would like to thank to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this meeting, and of course to Ferring Pharmaceuticals and personally to Otilia Pop for the kind invitation and making me possible to be here back to Budapest, a lovely city that I like very much to come. So being the next session about success rate, I think it was a good idea to start by defining success, because although it's something that should be obvious and clear, as we're going to see now in the next 20 minutes, is not that simple. Indeed, on this particular question, we are in a situation like when we can't see the wood for the trees, which means that it's in a scenario in which very often we get lost in the details, and we miss a whole view of the picture, and as we're going to see in the next minutes, we have so many definitions that sometimes make us to lose the goal. If we were asked to someone not involved in the field, if we asked to some colleague who is not working on IVF, and you ask him, what do you think it is success in IVF? Well, probably he would give us a very simple and clear answer. Well, if you have a number of patients that enter treatment, and then you have a number of patients that reach their goal, which is to have a baby, well then the success rate should be a ratio in which in the numerator you have those patients that end up having the baby, and in the denominator you will have those patients that entered into the treatment. So this seems quite obvious, and indeed this is what it was established as the standard success endpoint when we were doing IVF about 15 years ago. Indeed, it was already in 2003 when Esre already suggested that the live birth should be the final endpoint of IVF, and indeed they introduced this term, the BEST, B-E-S-S-T, which means birth emphasizing a successful singleton at term. So things look very clear from the theoretical point of view, but when we go into real life and we go to what is published, we see that this is not what is really happening. As an example, you can see here a review that includes only papers that were published in high-impact journals and papers in which there was a definition of a primary endpoint. And you can see that even given those inclusion criteria, less than half of the studies were reporting for live birth, not even 40%. And even more, if you look to the multiple birth rates, it was not reported even in 20% of the cycles. And as I said, this is a particularly selected sample of studies. But if we go to a more extended sample of studies, we'll see that in general, the number of studies which are reporting on singleton live birth don't reach even 20%. It's about 19%. But moreover, if we look to the studies in which the final endpoint was, or the study was powered and the study was designed to have live birth as an endpoint, are even less. It's just 7.4%. So this is what's happening in real life. In real life, most of the studies and probably most of units are not recording for live birth rate. And why is this happening? Well, we all know, because this is consuming resources. It is time consuming, it is money consuming. We need to contact our patients. Many of them left when they were on their 7th, 8th week of pregnancy. And sometimes it takes a lot of work to contact them and to get their feedback on how the pregnancy ended. So in the practical world, it's not that easy. And even when we are speaking about trials in which there is supposed to be a higher follow-up of patients, still their reporting is very low. So that's why some other authors have suggested that maybe ongoing pregnancy rate should be a better outcome, a better endpoint to consider. And they are supporting their argument with several reasons, as you can see here. Ongoing pregnancy rate has a higher incidence than live birth rate, of course. And this makes that from a study design perspective, you need a lower sample size to achieve your goal. If you go for ongoing pregnancy rate, you can do interim analysis much earlier, at least 6 months earlier than if you're going for live birth rate, because the results are available earlier. You can detect earlier if there is any arms of the study that it is futile or that you should withdraw because of adverse effects or very low outcome or whatever. Also, ongoing pregnancy rate is less subject to random error not related to the treatment under study. And also, they argue that ongoing pregnancy rate is really a good estimate of live birth rate, because in general it's estimated that live birth rate is going to be just 5-point difference to what we had on ongoing pregnancy rates. And at the end, they claim that ongoing pregnancy rate represents treatment effectiveness, and it does mask it by safety issues. And this is mainly defined by the risk of preterm delivery or a late pregnancy loss, most usually due to obstetrical issues. But what happens in general when we go to the literature? We can find situations like this. This is a very interesting review. It's including a selected sample of 142 articles, randomized controlled trials published between 2013 and 2014. And a deep analysis of all these trials show the following figures. As much as 361 numerators were defined in these studies, 87 denominators, and if we combine them, we have more than 800 distinct combinations of numerators and denominators. More than 800 in 142 studies. And just a fourth of them, 203, appear in more than one study. So most of the rates that were defined there, 112 of them, were not repeated from one study to other. So you can see how diverse and how creative we are when we are defining our endpoints. Even the median of outcomes that were defined in study was of 11, with a range that went from 1 to 36 outcomes in one single study. And finally, there was not any single outcome measure in the majority of the trials. So this is what we can see when we go to literature. So you can imagine how confused we can get. Because moreover, this brings a number of difficulties. This makes very difficult to compare safety and effectiveness for competing interventions. Makes difficult to assess the relevance and methodological validity of the results of the trials. And makes very difficult also to analyze results on meta-analysis. At the end of the day, quality of the meta-analysis, it depends on the quality of the studies that it's including. And all problems of heterogeneity in terms of outcomes are there, and makes that many times the conclusions that we read on the meta-analysis are weak. And one of the reasons it is this huge variability on the outcomes that that are presented. But it makes sense. Why is this happening? Well, this is happening mainly because IVF is a multi-stage procedure. From ovarian stimulation to pick up fertilization, everything in the lab, embryo transfer, to the final the goal of live birth, there are many stages of the procedure. And moreover, this can get even more complicated because in one IVF cycle, we can include also frozen embryo transfers with all their subsequent stages of the procedure. So obviously, this makes that at each step, we can make an analysis. And it makes sense. I mean, because most of these steps are correlated, and typically, if the previous step has a good performance, this is going to influence in the performance on the following step, and so on and so on and so on. So this means that if we are able to improve the performance in any of these steps, we probably will end improving the whole performance. But moreover, something that we have to keep in mind also is that this is happening in a limited time frame. So also, among all these variables, we have to consider it that time it is already playing a role, as we see a little bit later. So it is good that we measure all these intermediate parameters. Otherwise, we would never improve the whole thing. This is a basic rule for management. You can't manage that what you don't measure. So if you don't measure your intermediate outcomes, it's going to be very difficult that you can improve the whole thing. But let's go back to the study. How we are reporting? Well, here you can see that still in these randomized controlled trials, published 2013 to 2014, clinical pregnancy rate was still the most common outcome that was presented, close to 70% of the studies. And live birth was only presented in 37% of the studies. Ongoing pregnancy rate more or less the same. But moreover, and this is also very important when we are speaking about the outcome, it is the denominator, and we can see that still embryo transfer was in most cases the denominator. In most studies, clinical pregnancy rate was reported by embryo transfer, not by a started cycle. Very few studies reporting on cumulative live birth rate, as you can see, and even very exceptional to be reported cumulative live birth per started cycle. So this is what happens in real life. And moreover, we have also a variety of definitions. We're speaking about live birth, but still when you go to the studies, you will find that many of them, it is not defined. 51% of the studies, live birth is undefined. In 36 is live birth event with delivery, which is what it's in line with the, let's say, official definition of a live birth rate. And then you can see that live birth is defined irrespective of the duration of pregnancy. So you don't need to define 24, 28, 20, whatever, weeks of gestation. And of course, the newborn has to show at least any sign of being alive, of course. And the other issue is that when we define the delivery rate, we need to put the denominator if it's this per started cycle, aspirated, per embryo transfer, so on. Also important that we have a lot of differences among the studies on which moment the intervention is happening and the randomization is happening. And in some studies, there is not a consistency between the moment of the randomization and the moment of the intervention. And this is also introducing a huge bias in many of the studies. So this is important also that we take into account of this. Because if we are comparing two stimulation protocols and we are randomizing at the moment of pickup or of transfer, we are missing a lot of information from those protocols. Ovarian stimulation parameters, many studies report on the number of oocytes, more than 45% of them. Much less report on the mature oocytes. And reporting for the total dose of gonadotropins or the duration of iron stimulation, it's not too high, but maybe acceptable. Still, cancellation rate is poorly reported, only 13% of the studies. Fertilization and transfer outcomes. Fertilization is usually reported, but not that often that the number of good quality embryos, or if there were good quality embryos or not, number of frozen embryos. As you can see, they are not always reported. And regarding transfer, usually the number of embryos that are transferred are reported, more than half of the studies, and also more of the studies are reporting implantation rate. But implantation rate deserves further comments, because implantation rate is not the same depending if you count it per embryo transferred or you count it per patient. And sometimes, in many cases, this is not defined in the study. And implantation rate, it is reported as the primary endpoint, but it's not defined if this was calculated per patient or per embryo transferred. And this makes a big difference. And implantation rate, we have to take in account that it is very much influenced by the number of embryos that were transferred. So if we are running a study in which the number of embryos that are transferred between the arms is different, implantation rate probably is not going to be a valid outcome. This is very nicely shown in this example published by George Grisinger, in which one study compared elective single embryo transfer and PGS with double embryo transfer without PGS, was reporting higher implantation rates in the PGS because it was single embryo transfer all cases, 45%, versus 34% of implantation rate in the double embryo transfer. But the pregnancy rate was 10 points higher in the study with the double embryo transfer and no PGS, 55 versus 45. So this shows you how you have to interpret implantation rate properly to understand well the outcome of the study. Another example is if you are in your unit, you want to compare the performance of two of your doctors. And you have here two doctors treated 5 patients each. So you can see that the first doctor had an implantation rate per embryo transfer of 37.5%. The second doctor had 25%. It was lower. Well, when you look to pregnancies, it was the same, 40 and 40. And moreover, Dr. A, who had a high implantation rate, high multiples, and the other doctor didn't have. So if we look to implantation rate, we would say Dr. I is performing better than Dr. B. But if we go to single pregnancy, we will see that Dr. B is performing better. This is important also when you are analyzing the performance of a colleague or whatever. What about the adverse events? Unfortunately, they are not commonly reported. Multiple pregnancies are reported in 17% of the studies. Multiple live birth rate, not even 5%. OHSS as a general event is reported, but the degree is very, very unusually reported. General adverse effects and also perinatal outcomes, as you can see, they are really poorly reported. 6% birth weight, 4% congenital abnormalities, 2% gestational age. So very low reporting of this. Well, since the last 15 years in which this single live birth was suggested or proposed as the main outcome, there are other outcomes, particularly since the introduction and growth of vitrification and the improvement in cryopreservation techniques. We are speaking more and more about cumulative live birth rate, which defines the probability of achieving a pregnancy given one whole cycle or in a predefined time frame. You can see how this should be calculated. So we will have patients that get pregnant in cycle 1, cycle 2, or cycle 3, including the fresh and the frozen, and then you would divide by the total number of patients. This is how you calculate the cumulative live birth rate. But still, this can be calculated at a short term, let's say one egg collection or a period of 2 years, at a medium term, including a period of maybe 5 years, or even at the long term, including 3 episodes of pickup and more than 10 years. So still, this can be very variable. Numerators could be all live birth episodes or just at least one live birth episode. So introducing a new parameter, which I think is very important, but also adds a lot of diversity. Time to pregnancy, 50% of patients discontinue after 2 cycles. And therefore, we need to maximize live birth rates for each treatment attempt. So the conceptus of time to healthy singleton delivery can become increasingly important. And moreover, because we are treating patients that are typically older than 35, and as just Professor Ben Rafael showed, in these patients, time it is even more important. So we published a few months ago just a consensus in which a number of strategies in order to shorten the time to pregnancy were suggested and were proposed. So I think that we need to keep in mind also this, because it's not only the number of attempts, but it's also the time it's going to take. Well, last but not least, money counts. And maybe this is not very romantic and very scientific, but this is there. And when we have to decide between 2 strategies, it's not only how successful they are, it's also we need to know how much they are going to cost us. Maybe we have one intervention that has 2-3% higher success rates than another one, but it's double the cost. Is this really cost effective? Should we do this or not? So there are more and more studies reporting on cost effectiveness, and I think that this is the way we should go. And this has really grown exponentially in the last years since the financial crisis. And we could like it or not, but definitely this is going to be there. So dear colleagues, just a few reflections. Live birth rate, ideally, should be the primary outcome. But, question mark, is this realistic? Currently, as we have seen, is underreported. And even less often is defined as the primary endpoint, and the study is designed for that. Moreover, in most of times, it's reported by embryo transfer, but not birth started cycle. As a surrogate, ongoing pregnancy rate seems to be a good estimate. Of course, it's not the final outcome, but it has some practical advantages compared to live birth rate. Still, also, ongoing pregnancy rate needs a consensus for definition. According to the imprint definitions, it's 12 weeks, but some studies reported after 8 weeks, some studies 20 weeks. And so something that has been suggested is to the journals to allow submitting the studies, the manuscripts, when ongoing pregnancy rate is available for peer review. and then hold the publication until the live birth rate is reported. So this could be something helpful to finally have it. Other issues, as you have seen, large-scale diversity in outcome reporting in IVF trials, which introduces a number of methodological difficulties. And also there are some explanations there. I mean, there is a proposition of live birth as a primary outcome, but this would require all studies to be powered for that. And therefore, this would rule out the possibility of smaller explanatory studies for evaluating development strategies. And measuring intermediate outcomes is also crucial for improving the outcome. So these procedural outcomes should be also appropriate for these trials, but of course they would need confirmatory studies to counting for live birth rate as an endpoint required. All these initiatives that are promoting the reporting of clinical endpoints in all trials do not help, because at the end we have what is called outcome reporting bias, is that all authors try to have an outcome and they build it with the data that they have. So probably with pre-specifying the primary endpoint in the prospective registration of trials, we could prevent this. Very poor reporting on multiple birth rates and general adverse events, so also prevents us from viewing the whole picture. Increasing reporting of cumulative live birth rate, but we need for a consensus. And finally, as I said, we should not forget about time to pregnancy and on cost effectiveness. So, well, at the end of the day, we should go to, in my opinion, I think that the success of IVF should be the cumulative live birth rate per started treatment, which is the reproductive potential of one IVF cycle, one ovarian stimulation, one pickup, and all the oocyte and embryo cord that we obtain. So therefore, this would be the rate, but we have to take into account time and money. We cannot neglect that. So finally, I hope that at the end of the day, we will be able to see the woods for the trees. Thank you very much for your attention.